this panel is really a cross section of advocates across the country and advocates across the home-based food business ecosystem. So, in many ways, like Roya shared, we have started as the Cook Alliance with Advancing Advocacy as sort of the core starting point of this work. And then as we've had success in various places, namely California counties that have opted in, we've been able to start advancing into the building businesses and cultivating community, and then developing a data ecosystem around the work that's happening. But in the interest of starting at square one, we want to start this day off with talking about advocacy and talking about really the legal, legislative, and political change that's necessary to just make this even a possibility, not only in California, but across the country. And so if you think about the deep pilot work that Arroyo was just sharing about our work in San Diego, expanding business access there, that is only possible because we were able to pass the law in California, and it's analogous, and it's building off the backs of work that's been done in the cottage food movement, in the home-based food for mobile food vendors and food trucks. And these are all aspects of the same larger movement. And so to get everyone grounded in that reality, we wanted to have folks from a number of organizations that are looking at really all aspects of this, and not just in California, but across the country. And so we're really thrilled to have David from Forrager that has been really doing a lot of work in advocating for cottage food and centralizing and making accessible resources for cottage food operators across the country. We have Will from Ventures, which is a partner nonprofit of ours up in Washington State that's running a very similar MECO home cooking legalization bill to what we did here in California, and has a lot of deep experience to share about what it's like to try to expand this movement into other states. And then we have Erica and Jenny from the Institute for Justice, and specifically folks that have worked in the food freedom and food access pieces of the Institute for Justice's work across the country in making more accessible home-based business opportunities. And so and they've worked not only in cottage food or home cooking, but also the Institute for Justice has looked extensively at food trucks and mobile food vending and all these other parallel movements that we're talking about. So we have a really broad cross section here, and I feel like this conversation could go in a lot of different directions. And first of all, just thank you. I'm so thrilled to see everyone and know that we're all rowing in the same direction. I think I'd just love to, by way of introduction, maybe have us go around organization by organization and just have, maybe starting with David, a little bit of an introduction about your work and how it sort of intersects with the topic here today about the MECO movement. And so, David, we very much see the cottage food movement as a precursor and a close parallel to the MECO movement. And we would not be where we are today with legalizing home-cooked food sales if home food sales hadn't already been underway for more than a decade here. And so as someone that's really a leading expert in the cottage food movement, could you just share a little bit about yourself and also, maybe in just two minutes or so by way of introduction, what you're sort of seeing as the current momentum and both advances and setbacks of the cottage food movement across the country? I'm going to ask.
There we go.
You.
Yeah, so I run Forrager, which is a website I've run for over 10 years now. And I can't say that I did a ton to actually support the legislation for cottage food. It did help advance the amendment that came through California's Cottage Food Bill last year. But I've just sort of tried to put cottage foods on the map, literally, and I have summarized the cottage food laws and dissected them and tried to make them a bit more accessible So I have been publishing about the cottage food industry for over a decade now. And you're asking about how the advances and the setbacks for the cottage food movement. I think it's actually pretty similar to the MECO movement. And I would say that the main thing is the cottage food industry is just more mature. It's just farther along. And you look at any kind of cycle or any kind of movement, and it sort of has this wave. And I feel like with all of this, most of the states getting a cottage food law by about 2013, 2015, we sort of saw the end of that wave. And I felt like the Institute for Justice sort of like resurrected it. And then, I'd say the resistance to cottage food is pretty similar to the resistance in MECO. Like, it's just kind of sort of an unknown, like, is it going to work or is it not going to work? And so as states sort of push the envelope, then other states sort of hopped on the bandwagon. So I think we're just at the early stages of that with the MECO movement. And we're just like starting that curve upwards with that movement. And so it's just sort of like the same thing over again, but in a new and progressive way.
Yeah, a little bit of deja vu, and also exactly why we want David here on the panel and constructed the panel in this way, because there are such close parallels. So thank you, David, and welcome. I'll go to Will next. So Will's been one of the leaders in the Washington state legislative effort for legalizing home-cooked food sales for a few years now. And Will, I wonder if you could just, by way of introduction, share a little bit about what you've seen over the last couple of years in terms of, what's the same and what's different compared to California, and also a little snapshot of where you're headed in 2023 with your effort.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And hi, everyone. Thanks for sharing your time with us today. So what we have been focused on in Washington is, after our initial setback of trying to pass this law in 2018 and not quite making it across the finish line, we have realized, and I think this parallels the cottage food movement to some extent, that there needs to be ongoing coalition building and relationship building among the folks who are hoping to use these permits or use these programs, in order to make sure that, we can cross the finish line with one bill, but also that we can continue the good work that folks like the Cook Alliance are doing to tweak the bills, make them better, expand the income caps, whatever needs to be done to make sure that these programs continue to serve people as they need them. So my primary role in this is as a former advocacy director at Ventures, which is a nonprofit based in Seattle. And we have been trying, over the course of a few years, to build a statewide movement that includes, not just people from Seattle, but people from as many different communities as possible. And I'm also actually a PhD student at the University of Washington here. And so I've been trying to start a research project around this as well, that, I think that'll relate to some of the themes we talk about later in another panel. But, I think overall, like, we just, it's good to see that the Cook Alliance is still continuing to do all this work, because I think you need movement from all the different angles in order to be able to build a sustainable movement and sustainable momentum towards passing bills, improving them, and just making sure the programs are working. So, so that's basically what we're trying to do in Washington. To answer your last question, is we're trying to pass a MECO bill that looks at what California did, makes it slightly, make some slight improvements to make it more accessible for home cooks, and just continue working on that bill. And we see that, as something that's going to help our clients at Ventures, and also as part of the national movement as well.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, and we're really excited to be working with Will on the developing data aspect of all of this as well, and you'll hear more about that later. We're lucky to have smart people that are interested in folding this in with academia as we try to build legitimacy for the movement. So thank you, Will. And last but certainly not least, we have Erica and Jenny from the Institute for Justice. And in some ways, y'all probably have the widest aperture on this home-based food business movement. Institute for Justice has worked on mobile food vending, food trucks, cottage food, and now Miko's. And so maybe, by way of introduction, I could have one of you talk a little bit about the momentum that you've seen in recent years and going into 2023 in the home-based food business space. And then maybe the second one of you could share a little bit about what you see as interesting models or perhaps ideal models of how different states are legislatively opening up home-based food business opportunities for cooks across the country. So whichever one of you wants to start.
I can start. I think one thing that has really struck me and so many of us is the incredible momentum behind food freedom and Miko's and cottage food just in the last 7 years. I think if you're on the ground fighting, or if you're someone who's an entrepreneur and you want to be selling, sometimes it seems like the progress is very slow. But if you take a step back, I mean, just in the last 7 years, I think over 30 states have expanded their laws dramatically, both through legislative changes or lawsuits, and in large part due to the work of everybody here on this call. And I think we just have so much optimism about the future. And I think in 5-10 years, we're going to have even more states that have Miko laws or food freedom laws. And just the landscape is changing so quickly in such a positive way.
Yeah, and I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And I think the exciting thing is seeing how bipartisan or nonpartisan this issue really is, right? I think a lot of times, especially when we're dealing with things that involve public health, it can become a very partisan issue. But everybody supports these laws, right? I think everybody sees how obvious it is that home cooks should be able to sell their products. And so it's just nice to see that there's just such a groundswell of support for this stuff. In terms of best models, Utah and Wyoming are both really, really good food freedom laws and have really open laws. Erica, do you want to talk about Wyoming a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I think I totally agree with Jenny. I would say Wyoming and Utah. And I think that's when you take everything, when you look at both the foods that you can sell, how hard is it, to get started? What's the red tape? How many, where you can sell? And when you take all of those factors, I think those two states are probably the best. Wyoming actually has a recent provision in their law that says that you can sell to the maximum extent allowed by federal law. I think they're still implementing that, but even with that new provision, it's still incredible law. And Utah now, it's both a food freedom and a Miko state. So you can sell almost any food that you want without a license, permit, or nothing. You could just start selling. If you want to sell foods that have beef or pork or other meats, that's the only time you need a license or an inspection. So that's incredibly broad. Great, terrific law, both on its face and in implementation.
Yeah, totally. Thank you both. It's one of the really striking things that we hear a lot and have definitely observed ourselves is just how uniquely bipartisan this issue is, and how the advance of it really feels like it hits home for very different constituencies, sometimes for very different reasons across the country. And part of our work has been figuring out in different cultural and political contexts, state by state, what types of bills are actually doable and how they compare, and how we can take best practices or learnings across different places and then sort of amend or shape the legislation and the policy so that they work in different states' contexts. And so it's really helpful to have your organization bringing in that national perspective. I think, part of where I'd like to go with the group, we almost need to start in the negative before we can get positive. And I'd love to just hear from everyone's perspective what the biggest limitations you hear and bring to policymakers are from from home cooks and other home-based food producers, you know, whether it's with the MICO law or a cottage food law or, you know, just operating informally. Like what are the biggest, what are the most hot button issues that you feel are important to surface? And, you know, it's, I guess we'll start there. And even though it's kind of a negative thing, it's like, what are the problems? Because that's what we're working to fix. So anyone can jump in and start. We'll just do a kind of a rapid fire round of getting in the dirty.
Well, I don't think it's so much about problems as much as barriers. And this kind of goes to one of the questions that was just posed in the chat. You know, why are more people not on board? Every time we go into a state, we see two types of opposition. One is from health departments and departments of agriculture who have this fear that if this is homemade, it must be unsafe. We're afraid of people having their cats on the counter, baby diapers on the counter, people not washing their hands. And a lot of that is completely blown out of proportion and almost gets to the point where it's almost hysterical. I remember I was testifying in Nebraska about a cottage food law a couple of years ago, and a health inspector, I think it was actually the head of their department, testified that if they allow the sale of homemade cupcakes, hundreds of people were going to die. Now, of course, these foods have been legal they're now legal in all 50 states, at least the shelf-stable homemade foods. And it is virtually unheard of for anyone to get sick. And there's simple reasons for that. You know, people have their reputation, their name at stake. They want to please their customers, especially now in 2022 when everything's online and there's Yelp reviews and Google reviews. So I think the safety issue is overblown. And the other barrier we see is fear of competition. Anytime one of these bills is passed, brick and mortar businesses come forward and say, hey, it's not fair that these businesses get to come in and not have the overhead of a brick and mortar shop. That's not fair to me. That's going to put my brick and mortar out of business. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about that. And especially now in the wake of the pandemic, it's important to see these businesses as complementary, that home-based businesses can help brick and mortars and, you know, work hand in hand with them.
Maybe I can shed a little bit of light on how it affects the individual, because when people come to my website, they have the opportunity to sign up for a mini course. And then when they do that, I directly ask them via email, like, what are the challenges you're facing? So I hear stories from people every day. And I'd say the biggest challenges that people are facing, for one, would be just confusion and overwhelm, because it's like sometimes very, very complicated to start businesses. And that is in large part due to the laws, and in large part due to just every single city and county being different. And then I'd say the other thing is just frustration with what they can do with their business. So in a lot of states, you can only sell non-perishable food. So if you have to put it in the refrigerator, then you can't sell it. So obviously the MICO law and that movement is trying to help that. But I'd say those are probably the top two biggest challenges that I'm seeing from individuals.
Definitely.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I agree with y'all.
Great. Jenny, you want to chime in, or should we move on?
I think everybody agrees.
Yeah.
I think to some of the questions in the chat about why other counties aren't opting in, I think part of it too is just, whenever you ask regulators to do something, and you're asking them to do something that takes some of their authority away, it's just can be a more difficult sell, right? And so that's why we have to tell our county leaders in California why this is so important to us.
Yeah, totally. And that reminds me, there's definitely an open invitation for everyone on the webinar to ask questions in the chat, and we'll do another 10 minutes here, and then we'll try to leave the last 15 minutes or so for audience questions and dialogue. So keep them coming, and positive or negative, we want to hear your frustration or your hopes and dreams. So I think that what we're talking about sort of raises the most recent momentum, which is in in California, as David alluded to, we recently had an increase in the cap for what sellers are able to, how many dollars a year sellers are able to sell for cottage food in California. And we also had a relatively easy passage of a bill, Senate Bill 972, which allows mobile food vendors to use micro enterprise home kitchens to prepare and sell their food. And so, I'm sort of just curious how the most recent momentum and what we're sort of seeing both as problems that cooks face as well as barriers that are more macro can be addressed as we look ahead to bills in other states. To Will, your effort in Washington, what do we think the likelihood of new states coming in with a state level mandate, for example, rather than county opt-ins and things like this? Do we think the movement is there, or what stands in the way of getting us to something that looks a little bit more unified and state level, like cottage food, versus where the MECO movement started out in California, which was a little bit more of a patchwork?
Yeah, so I think the big thing on SB 972 is the fact that basically cottage food producers can now sell their stuff from a mobile food cart or as a mobile street vendor. That's huge, right? Particularly when it comes to bringing, cultural foods to communities and adding to that vibrancy of all of the diverse groups that live in California. The challenge in that is that, MECO's producers can only do that if their county allows them to be a MECO's producer, right? And so, but the stage is set so that either if more counties opt in, or if we're able to get a state mandate where every county has to opt in, that means that everybody can start selling their stuff, not just from home, but at cultural events and, outside church on a Sunday morning and all of those types of things, which is going to be huge, just to open pathways to entrepreneurship for folks.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing in Washington State, to answer your last question, Matt, is I don't think it's more difficult. It's going to be more difficult here to pass a law that has no opt-in clause for counties. It doesn't seem to be a huge sticking point, because I think a lot of legislators understand that it's just more efficient to have a statewide law. It just makes more sense, to be completely honest. Obviously, I'm quite biased, but I do think that's true. I don't think there's any reason why somebody who's in, in our area would be like, if you're in South King County, you can have a permit, but then if you drive 3 miles south, you're not allowed to have a permit. That just has never made sense to me, even though I do understand there's different levels of government. So, the other thing I wanted to say is that while that's one way that maybe we're trying to improve California's law, I also think we're continuing to learn from the work that you all are doing. Like, I love the idea of having some budget funding to make it more accessible. For the state of California, $5 million is not really very much money, to be completely honest. And so if that can help people get into these businesses and get these permits, then I think it's a really good investment for California to make, because, as Jenny was just mentioning, the benefits of everyone on this call's businesses are not just the literal food that you're producing and then, the money that's going back in your pocket, not to mention the tax revenue, but it's also like there is a community aspect of this. And I think, it's important to be able to share your cultural heritage. And that's definitely something that we've heard from a lot of our home cooks. So just to say, we're continuing to follow what you all do. And I think it's good to have this forum to debate, good ideas and try to figure out how to prioritize them when we're in those tense conversations during legislative session.
Just to piggyback off of what Will was talking about with the opt-in, obviously it's a big issue with the MECO laws, but I'm not so sure that we're going to see that a lot in states as states consider MECO laws. I mean, I don't know. I don't work on the MECO legislation, but on the cottage food side, from my memory, I think it was just California and Illinois that ever put any kind of county specific language into their cottage food laws. For California's Class B, for Illinois, it was with their home kitchen operation law. So those happen to be some of the most regulated states out there, but I don't really see that likely being an issue for most states.
I agree with David, and Illinois has actually since gotten rid of theirs and made
Yes.
theirs into a state mandate. The only other state that I think has something which is arguably an opt-in is Maine, but it's different in that it says, hey, if you're a local government, you can do whatever you want. So it allows incredible discretion from the counties and cities in a way that's actually very beneficial. And I think that if you are going to ever have county specific legislation, it should operate like that. Like maybe the state sets a floor and then local governments can go further. But I think there's reason for optimism that California will one day, maybe soon, no longer be opt-in and it will be a state mandate.
And on the cottage food side, California has now removed that county specific thing too. So.
Yeah, it's definitely our hope to move in that direction. I'm seeing in the chat a lot of questions and sometimes well-warranted frustration about.
Yeah, I'm frustrated too, guys. So I'm with you.
But it can sometimes feel a little crazy where an arbitrary county line means a difference in the ability to do this. And for those who are more recent to the movement, it was very much a last minute concession that was made. Was never the design in California, and was a last minute concession that we had to make to not have it killed in a certain committee by a certain very skeptical lawmaker. And so it's definitely our goal and our hope that we can move out of that paradigm pretty soon. And we're excited for 2023 and beyond for both California and to hopefully pass some really best in class examples of this law in new states.
And not to be too down on California, but when the law passed, it was groundbreaking. It was the first state that allowed the sale of meats and prepared meals. Now there's several states that do that, but California was the first, and the bill got so much media attention that it helped push the national movement. So I don't have regrets about it passing the way it did at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, good. Us either. It feels like we have to. It's one foot in front of the other. So, I'm seeing questions about what current MECO owners can do in terms of advocacy, and I think that's a question that just home cooks or wannabe home business owners are often asking themselves. And this year's theme of the conference is power in numbers, and so I'd love to do a round of discussion about that. We'll be talking about things that we can do organizationally in some of the later panels around developing data and making this getting media attention and these sort of things. But from your view and for each of you as advocates and advocacy organizations, what do you see as the most important things that can be surfaced by individuals who want to contribute to this movement? What are the things that really help policymakers or skeptical regulators see the benefit of these changes and get on board?
The biggest thing you can do is share your story. So when Eric and I go to a legislature to testify in favor of expanding home foods, they don't really want to hear from us, right? We can be experts on the law and, experts at organizing, activists and things like that. But they want to hear how this bill would improve the lives of their constituents. They want to know that they're doing something good for the people that they represent. And so something that we do now when we go to testify or when a bill is up for a vote is we'll send an action alert to people whose information that we have, who live in a state, and say, hey, tell your senator why this is important. Here's a link to write him a letter, explain what this would mean for you. And those are the most valuable things that a legislator can receive. So my, request of the group would be when the Cook Alliance or IJ or whomever sends out an alert and says, hey, here's how you can help, actually get involved, and tell your friends to get involved and sign up for everybody's newsletter so that we can keep you updated for when these calls to action need to happen. They often happen very last minute, where a bill will get a hearing, in a couple days' time. And so, we would just really love the more people who were standing ready to provide their story and their testimony, the better. And that's really what's going to move the needle on these votes.
Yeah, I overall agree with that. I think there's a couple things that I would add as well. I think it's maybe different if you're in a context, there might be people on this call from like Arizona or Iowa or, other places where the movement is maybe not as clear cut or as robust as it is in other places. I don't actually know that about those two specific states, but my point is it will depend a little bit on your context. I will say, like if you're in California, it sounds like from the comment in the chat and from what I've heard that, a single individual or a small group of individuals can really be powerful in helping a county, encouraging a county to adopt one of these ordinances. So in that sense, the opt-in program is an opportunity because you're at a smaller level of government. In Washington state, I would say like, if you can contribute an hour to tell me your story, that's great. If you can contribute 10 hours over the course of the next 6 months, we need people who are going to be bugging their legislators about this, to be completely honest, because Jenny, you said it best, like they don't want to hear from me. They've heard from me enough. Let me tell you, I have been bugging the people who make the decisions about this stuff for 5 years, and I'm going to keep doing it, but it's a lot more helpful if, we can have some local partners on the ground who are saying, here's my individual business. I can't get it off the ground, or I'm having these issues in my personal life because I can't make money the way that I want to. That's a lot more powerful than anything I could ever say.
Just speaking to the individual level, I mean, I know people get very overwhelmed with the thought of like, I don't know how to put a bill or a piece of legislation out there. But what I experienced when I started, the first thing I did was called Erica and tried to see if they'd help. But I think once it got started, like there's so many people that are part of that process and help support it along the way. We've got the Cook Alliance, we've got the Institute for Justice. And the other thing is just my local legislators were not interested in doing the bill. So I had to like put a message out to like try to get other people to reach out. And only like 10 people did talk to their legislators, and 9 people, their legislators weren't interested in either, but one person, right, their legislator was. And if she had not reached out to her legislator, then that bill never would have happened. So you just never know. And so you never know what like the potential is if you as an individual reach out to somebody. It could change everything.
Thanks, y'all. So I promised we'd turn over to some audience questions now. And I think William's question here, one of the most recent questions in the chat, is a good one, and sort of it's a segue into some of the next components of today's conference, including building businesses and starting to really lower the barriers to implementation once the laws are passed. But it also is an input and sort of an iterative feedback cycle as we look at these laws. And so whether it's in Cottage Food or Miko's or other home-based food businesses that y'all work with, I'm curious what you see as, to Will's question, some of the biggest barriers to folks actually just getting the permit once they're able to do so. So, obviously, as he mentions, cost is a factor. Complexity, as David mentioned, whether it's for the permit or just the overwhelm of starting a small business, can be a big piece. Health inspectors are often understaffed and can be slow to get back to people. All sorts of barriers. And as we think about, like, with our advocacy hats on, how we can improve these bills, either with budget or different provisions in them, would love to just hear everyone comment on that. Why aren't people getting the permits when they are available?
I think it's just the big picture. Like when you may be thinking in your head, gosh, I have this great recipe, I want to start a business. I get emails from people like that every day. But when you tell them what they actually need to do to get the business off the ground, it's completely overwhelming to them. But when you have other states where all you have to do is register, or you don't have to do anything, you don't need registration or permit, those people can just start selling immediately. And then they can figure out, hey, has this been successful? Should I now expand? Whereas they don't even know if they'll be successful and they have to invest all this cost and time up front.
Matt, is your question for MECO permits?
I think that the analog with cottage food is interesting too. It's like California, for example, is a huge state. And even before we passed the MECO thing, we were curiously looking at the fact that only a couple thousand people ever got a cottage food permit, and that sort of number stayed relatively flat over the years. And so I think your experience in cottage food is interesting and analogous as well.
Well, I was just saying, like with the MECO permits, like one thing is the cost, right? I talked to MECO yesterday. It said the cost is $700. I mean, that's a barrier right up front that's going to prevent somebody from going that route. But in general, like for the cottage food people I talk with, like the reason why they might not go through the permitting process is, I mean, there's complexity there, but also just sometimes it's really hard to get in touch with the health department or the ag department. Like I heard stories all the time, just like they cannot even get them to do anything, right? So sometimes it's literally just because that's like extremely slow going. I have a recent story of that, but I'd say there's a variety of factors. And I'd say though, that if somebody really wants to get a permit, generally speaking, they can put in the time and get one. Like it's usually pretty doable, but sometimes people just don't have the desire to.
Yeah, totally. And we'll be talking a lot about costs, bringing down costs, and providing some additional support to just make this easier in some of the upcoming panels. $850 in some counties plus a business plan. It's a lot. So I saw a hand up, Delilah. There it is. Let me bring you on here and you can ask your question.
It's not really a question, but it's a statement and a thank you.
Great.
Because I'm still in the process of getting my permit. Karen and Roya have been great support. I just want to let them know that I was able to get that grant and starting to do some of the things that I had visioned being done for my business so I can get that permit. I have this vision and I just cannot move forward until it looks like what that vision is supposed to look like. But I just wanted to, say thank you to them for their support and putting me in contact with the San Diego business community to get this grant. And so, for anybody else that's online, stay encouraged. There's opportunities out there and it'll happen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Delilah. Thanks for coming on. Great. Let's see if there's any final. We probably have time for one more question. It's really nice to hear from these success stories like Delilah's, and we'll be hearing more of those throughout the day. So I could probably take one more question if there are any. Otherwise, I think we in our final 5 minutes could just do one round of closing thoughts, either in terms of what you're most excited about personally or organizationally looking forward to 2023, and or maybe a call to action for cooks that are listening and want to contribute to the advocacy or to your organization's work.
Could I actually, Matt, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could I actually ask a question of the group? I think we could maybe learn from this. Somebody mentioned ghost kitchens in the chat and said that that's like, it seems like a good resource, but maybe a limitation as well. So I was just wondering, I don't really know what that term means, but I was just curious about how people are using that and, what are the limitations around that, because I know we're trying to bring it into your home kitchen, but like, I don't know, is that not enough? Or I'm just curious.
Yeah, I can just briefly ground everyone in what the term ghost kitchen often means, which is the term has been popular in recent years as basically a commercial food facility that has no physical storefront, and so people are using, and these are often more corporate food producers are, actually some of the biggest restaurants in the country now are no longer building new brick and mortars with storefronts, but they're just doing what's called a ghost kitchen, where they have a back of house facility where they produce whatever it is, burgers and fries, and then it's only available for order through DoorDash or some of these third-party delivery apps. And it's, the analog, I think, for our work and the MECO space in general is that a lot of MECOs are looking at shared commercial kitchen spaces as an alternative, either for cooking their food before it's legal to do so at home, or if they want to scale up from where they started. And so we very much see that as an interesting stepping stone, and that development of more shared commercial kitchen space is another really parallel thread, and one that we've been supporting. And I see people talking about it in the chat, but they're often very, very expensive. And so we see and not to mention, if you're just doing it through third-party delivery, sometimes people only know you as the DoorDash burger joint, and they don't actually give any more ownership or pride of authorship to the cooks themselves. And so we see it as an interesting parallel movement, and anyone else can comment on it, but I'll just share that because I do think it's a term kind of hot on the scene, and one that we've been tracking closely as a development.
To change the subject a little bit before we end, I wanted to know actually from you, Matt, or Erica or Jenny, like, there obviously Utah passed their law last year, and then this year there were some initiatives in other states for this kind of MECO or micro restaurant thing. Those did not pass, and so obviously will with Washington again, but like, do we know where the resistance is and why other states are having these problems?
What were the two states you said, David? I'm sorry, I was answering a question in the chat.
I know that obviously Washington has tried twice now, and then what was it? I didn't actually mention the states, but there was I think 3 or 4 on my list that I would consider, micro restaurant laws that were put, bills that were put forth in the legislature this year.
I think part of the problem is there was one particular company that was pushing those bills, and that particular company didn't have any legislative experience. And so they were newbies and kind of learning as they went along. I mean, it's very admirable. It was great that they were doing it, but I wasn't surprised to see those bills passed. And as to Washington state, Washington has a reputation of having a particularly dysfunctional legislature. I'm sorry, Will. So
hey, I'm not in the legislature.
that state, we've always seen, Washington state has one of the worst homemade food laws in the nation. And I think it's going to take a tremendous amount of effort to change that, just because of the culture of the legislature, which is very much pro-regulation, pro-red tape, not friendly to entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it was basically exactly what you said earlier, is that it's the Department of Health who opposes it, and then it's competition from the Hospitality Association here, represents a lot of restaurants because they have some restaurant associations under them. So it's basically we don't think this is safe from the health department, with no data to back that up. And then the Hospitality Association not appreciating that these businesses could be potential additions to their association in the future, and not to mention in the short term they're probably competing for different customers anyway, or not competing because of different customers. So yeah, I agree with you basically that we're kind of banging our head on a wall. We got pretty close to breaking through the wall a couple of years ago, but it is a tough environment, I think, in comparison to a lot of other states.
I had a couple answers for things in the chat. People were talking about ways to find a commercial kitchen. The most common way I've seen is church kitchens. And someone mentioned old school kitchens. Sometimes you can find a school that's willing to rent out their commercial kitchen space, especially during odd hours. You could also find a restaurant maybe willing to rent out their commercial space during the night when they're not operating. So sometimes you can get creative. There was a question about requiring health insurance. There has yet to be, I'm sorry, not health insurance, business insurance, to try to alleviate these concerns about, oh, if somebody gets sick, well, you have insurance. There's yet to be a state that required that, even though it's come up a lot. And I think it's because if you're getting to the point of whether or not you have insurance, that means you already got someone sick. And health inspectors don't want people to get sick at all, understandably. And I think our role is to just show that these businesses are safe. So if you are already selling homemade food, please go above and beyond to make sure that you don't get anybody sick, because it just takes one to torpedo this entire movement in California.
Totally. And yeah, as we'll talk about more, it's part of the resources that we're working to offer are reduced cost insurance and all these different, you know, it's very much a daunting proposition to start any business. And as we're talking about, like the hurdles only get higher as you get to shared commercial kitchen spaces, even if you're going to a church or a school. And so lowering those barriers as much as possible, hopefully being very careful at home, but then, you know, we live in a litigious country and people, you know, when I've seen a lawsuit brought against a home cook for something that was totally unrelated to the food that they produced. And so making sure that if people are operating businesses, just like any business in this country, they have access to resources, business education, and the tools to do it in a way that makes it safe and sustainable for them. So we are a bit over time. There's a ton of good chatter in the chat, and thank you, Erica, for picking up on some of those threads. I guess maybe one sign-off call to action if people have it, or just a word or a sentence about what you're most excited about for 2023, and then we'll bid adieu to our advocacy panelists and move on to building businesses. Let's maybe start off with Jenny.
Sure. I mean, we are always beating the drum for calls to action, so please get in touch with us if you want to be up to date on what's happening. You know, we're going to be actively working in California this year, and if you're from another state, let us know, because we're probably working there too. So just, yeah, stay involved, tell us your stories, and just, you know, be really, really militant about advocating for yourselves. And we're going to get things done.
Erica?
I'm excited specifically about what's going to happen in Arizona and in California. I have a lot of hopes for those states, and I think in the next few years, I would really like to see my home of DC pass a MECO law.
Yes, it's where my sister-in-law is too, so I've got a vested interest. David?
Yeah, I agree with that. Arizona would be interesting to see, but I would say just more broadly, like I mentioned at the beginning, just interested in seeing this movement become just a little bit more rooted and grounded. And, you know, we could see we're kind of on the upward curve. And so eventually the wheels will start to get in motion, and like other states will start to hop on the bandwagon as it becomes more of a national movement. And it's just going to be interesting to see like what the next step is in 2023.
Yeah, thanks, David. And Will?
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting to hear about those other states making progress. I hope that it encourages our legislators to understand the importance of this bill. And if you're in Washington or just interested in learning about Washington's bill, we have a monthly coalition meeting that is, I believe the next one's on December 13th at 9:30 Seattle or Washington time. So if you want, I'll leave my email in the chat, but if anybody wants to join those coalition calls, that's where we kind of give updates on Washington State, and everyone is welcome.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for the amazing work that you're doing. We're really so grateful to be in partnership with every one of you. And here's to the bandwagon building in 2023. So thank you.